Please welcome Lynne Jones. So Lynne is here at the University of Washington. She is the LSST performance scientist. So she is the person who probably understands best how we're going to deploy the LSST, or what are the kind of constraints in deploying the LSST, and what happens if you try to do this or try to do that to the observing cadence. So if you care about the observing strategy, about how LSST is actually going to be on the sky, Lynne is the right person to talk to, and she's going to tell us.
There are other people to talk to too, but yeah. So it's a
but you're here.
Big fit. Yeah, I'm here, and I care about the solar system, and so I'm a good person to talk to. So I'll talk about the OpSim and small body metrics. Please stop me and just put your hand up if I go past something that is obvious to me but is not obvious to everybody else. Because I wrote this and I've seen this for a long time, so it's very easy for me to start. So OpSim, what is OpSim? What is the metrics analysis framework? This is the sort of the framework we're hoping you'll write your small body metrics in. So the OpSim is the operations simulation, and this generates simulated pointing histories with realistic conditions. So it's got a model of the telescope, it's got a model of the weather conditions. It's got models that tell you how to interpret things like the dim measurements of the seeing to the seeing all over the sky. Eventually, this will have things like that grow up to be the actual real LSST scheduler. So OpSim is made of two components. One is like the simulation of the observatory. One is the scheduler. That scheduler will be eventually be the actual LSST scheduler. So you care about making sure that our scheduler and our simulation can do the things that you want to do. So OpSim generates these pointing histories. They come complete with a record of the RA deck and the seeing and the 5 sigma depth, all of these things. If you want to evaluate what we would see for moving objects, you take another software package we have called Sims Moving Objects, provide a set of orbits, basically objects, and that will generate the observations that LSST would acquire for a given simulated survey. So there's sort of 3 steps to getting to your metrics. And then the last step is to analyze those observations. And for that, we use the metrics analysis framework, MAF. And basically, you write a metric that would apply to all the observations of one object. And so maybe you say something very, very simple. How many observations will I get for this object? Maybe above a certain signal to noise or something like that. And that can be your metric. And MAF provides the framework to apply that to all of the objects and generate plots, do simple summaries over the entire population, for example, things like that. So most of MAF was originally intended to work on sort of a stationary pointing basis, but it also does work for these observations of moving objects. So think about it that way. You can use it for moving objects. You could also do it for pointings on the sky, and then MAF gives you a different set of tools for like making a sky map across the sky, for example. So,
sorry, will it actually? Are you saying that we would actually target a specific? We haven't had an observation series for 10 days. And we actually target that, or
so it depends. So MAF gives you. It's not really something that is like running in real time. Mm-hmm. It's more intended to take a moving objects, and then whatever metric you write, like if you say, look for the longest gap between observations, or count how many times there's a gap of 10 days between observations, and then it will report that per object. And then there's other tools in the framework that will say, okay, across the whole population, what's the mean number of these gaps, things like that. And what's handy is that orbits. I said orbits, not individual objects, because a lot of the time when you're doing metrics to analyze how well is the survey performing on something, you don't actually need to take like all 800 or 80,000 EDIOs, or you don't need to take all 6 million main belt asteroids. You just maybe want a representative sample. And if you can separate the H distribution and the orbit distribution, like you can for most objects, right? You can just simulate the orbits and get the observations. And then you can say, okay, what if the object magnitude was this, or absolute magnitude was this, what if it was this, what if it was this? So that you can build up plots like this where you're saying, as a function of absolute magnitude, what is this metric result? And you're basically taking your same orbit and cloning it over a range of H magnitude. So it's a framework that makes it easier to do that. Like, you don't have to worry about cloning it over the H distribution. You can take a population where you've set, these are the particular H values, and I want to keep those H values. I don't want to clone over H. So you can take that and then say, this is the metric, for each of these objects, and they really are objects that come with an orbit and an H magnitude, in case your H and orbit distribution are not separable. But for most things they are, and so this lets it run a lot faster. So you could take, say, 2,000 NEOs or main belt asteroids, generate all of the. So you might take a particular simulated survey. You might have, like, let's say 10 of those you want to evaluate and see, when I change these various aspects about the observing cadence or the survey strategy, what happens to whatever thing it is that I care about. And you're talking about, like, statistically across the population, right? So let's say what we care about is something super simple, the observing arc, or the maximum number of observations you get in one season or something. So you might have your series of OpSim runs. You might take sort of a sample of 2,000, maybe 5,000 orbits. You generate all of the observations that LSST would get in each of those 10 simulated surveys for that limited number of representative orbits. And this does is it will report the signal to noise, including trailing losses, for each of your observations, assuming a given H. But it doesn't reject any at this point, right? So even if they're way below the limiting magnitude, it's still going to report an observation, because later you can clone over a range of H's, and that might bring it back up above the limiting magnitude. Right? So you would take your orbits, representative sample, generate these observations for each of your 10 simulated surveys. Then you can run them through MAF, where you have the same metric, and you just apply it to each of those series of observations. And in that case, so what was our example? Oh, the number of observations in a given season. So maybe you're just reporting the maximum for each object. And then, since you're cloning over H, it'll say, for this object at this H magnitude, or what if it was at this other H magnitude? And so then you get a number, like maximum number of observations in a given season for each of your objects. But probably what if you're going to look at the analysis, you might care, looking at an orbital plot, what's the maximum number for each of these orbits, or you might care just as a function of H magnitude, what's the median number of observations in a given season across the population.
So, Lynne, just a step back, right?
Mm-hmm.
The MAF is how LSST is going to decide these cadences tick off for every science collaboration. This is, you did our top science, whatever, right? So that this MAF framework is in essence, or what you're saying with these analyzes, is that at some point we have to come up with metrics and why we've been hounding you for these quantitative measures for each of our science priorities to say, this is the thing we really want, whether it's all these objects greater than it or less than H, whatever. MAF is the way that we would figure out that every LSST simulation gives us that, or none of them give us that, and it was our highest priority thing. So whether surveys are good or bad.
Yeah, if people provide us, what we would like is that people provide us the metrics and, like, sort of a figure of merit output. That's like
Do you
sort
mean
of
the
a
actual code or the idea behind that?
Yeah, well, so I will get to that. That ideally you give us the actual code. It is set up to be relatively simple. There's a very standard API for the metric, and you just write like, assuming I was given one object at one H magnitude, these are the things that I have access to about that observation, or all of the observations for that object at that H magnitude. What is the output, right? So it's the simplest way that you could evaluate, that you can do it. You don't have to worry about standardizing it across the population. You don't have to worry about like figuring out which observations go with which object. You just say, hey, if you gave me all the observations for this object, what is my criteria? And
what's the current status of the Sims moving objects part of this package?
yeah, so for it's there, it works. For a lot of the stuff that you do, it's probably not quite so efficient, which is one of the reasons I was talking about doing it with a more limited sample.
When you say limited, is it runtime?
Yeah, pretty much. Like if you're and plus you don't necessarily care, right? You have, if you have 10 simulations to run across, you're interested in what the statistical answer is. You're not interested in like what is the details or what is the exact details for if I had put in a full 80,000 objects. You're going to get the same answer as you would with 5,000 or 2,000 and forming it over age. That said, so I said it doesn't necessarily work for what you're doing, but there are improvements we're making on there, and I think there's a lot of code that you can use. Want to do, for example, we do account Sims moving objects will account for the camera footprint, and like I said, it adds trailing losses, and it cross-references all the observations from OpSim. And given that so what it uses for the ephemeris generation underneath is OpenR. So when I said it's a little bit less accurate than you want, that's partly because of some of the limitations that used to exist on OpenR, but Mikhail's actually recently fixed propagation from the Python front. So that's great, and we can probably do what you need to do within there now.
Maybe we could put some of the things that we've written already.
Yeah. At one point, I wrote a module like using Atom. I think we'll hear more about Atom.
Yeah.
It
seems like it's a good opportunity for us to add something.
Yeah, exactly. Ephemeris generation in the cloud and could generate. So you wouldn't be limited necessarily to doing this with 2,000 objects. Although, like I said, for most of this, you don't really care.
But the things where you have the ephemeris and you want to know what has LSST observed, what has fell through the cracks in the camera footprint, things like that. Like that code really takes care of all that. Some ways that's a code.
We added to that.
Yeah.
So you're propagating each object to each frame time?
No. So currently, what Sims moving objects, the default way of using Sims moving objects, there's multiple options, but the default way is that it propagates to a series of points in time that you can say how close those time steps should be. And then it just does linear interpolations between all of those points.
On the sky?
In time. So one object says, okay, here's 10 years of the survey. I generated this object every 2 hours. Linear interpolation between all of those actual points in time. And then, so that's where it's not accurate, right? Especially for NEOs. For other things like TNOs, it's fine. And then for the times, it matches those interpolations against the times of the observations, and so it says that these are the observations where you could see the object. So you could also do that, like linear approximation to get which fields it was roughly in, and then do if you had kept propagating the orbits to each day. And then you could do an exact ephemeris calculation. You'd want to, we haven't rewritten some of the other stuff, like you'd want to do it in a bit the other order, like currently we go through each object to do that. But if you were saying, let's propagate them all to all the objects to each night, you'd probably want to do it from all of the objects and give me the observations in that night. There's also MP Checker, which I have heard is upgraded, almost ready to go and be publicly released, and that would be another option that I think we'd like to fold back into this.
Steve's also like.
Jonathan who has a tool that's complete.
Yeah, and
Makes
he was
SDK
using
files.
the SPK files, yeah, that's right.
Maybe this makes a good conference session.
Yeah. Okay.
Real quick, just roughly, how many?
So I'm not going to count this at the moment. I mean, you could. Well, okay, sure. So to generate a simulated survey, and I have more actual real-time hours. I mean, so assuming our standard, not terrible, but not super high-end CPUs. To generate the OpSim output is about sort of 50 to 60 hours, depending on how complex the decisions going into the scheduling are. And to generate sort of about 2,000 objects, I haven't parallelized it at all, and you totally could because it's trivial. And that's one of the things I want to write a script for. It's sort of around 4 hours for a 10-year survey for about 2,000 objects. And then the metric stuff, that depends a lot on what your metric is. For the things like discovery, where you're doing a lot of do I have a series of observations, and then do they match a given time frame, and you have a lot of conditions on it, that's maybe like half an hour or so. Actually, that part I don't really remember. It's not half an hour for a single discovery criteria. I'm thinking of, I would have to double check that. Yeah, it's on the order of probably maybe around 10 minutes, I'd say.
You have to have dinner.
Dinner after this. I don't know what time zone I'm in. So I came in at 1
I can't
2
talk
a.m.
for a long time. It's true.
There we go. No dinner. No dinner in turn.
Yeah.
But just that way.
So I wanted to, but it's good to be clear on what these steps are, because a lot of people ask me, hey, what about OpSim? Do you actually care about OpSim, or are you caring about your metrics on a given OpSim run? And that's more at the MAF stage. And then we have this additional tool that goes in the middle that's very useful for a solar system. Okay. So I just wanted to run through a very high-level description of the metrics we have already, so you kind of have this in your mind. Please see Chapter 3 of the Community Observing Strategy Evaluation paper, the COSEP. This is what was formerly known as the Observing Strategy White Paper, but for reasons that we're calling for a bunch of white papers on the observing strategy, and to avoid confusion, this is now to be known as the COSEP. This is the big GitHub community input paper that is available already. It has contributions from all the science collaborations. It has quite a lot written about the solar system that could definitely be expanded and supported in more depth and can use more metrics. But what we have there covers pretty much metrics about discovery. So how many objects, can you discover a particular object? How many objects can you discover across the population? So for an individual object, you'd say, what's the time of discovery? How many opportunities did I have for discovery? And then you would summarize that across the population as what's the completeness across the population. Maybe as a function of age, maybe as a function of, or so on. Then we have some very simple things like the number of observations or the total arc length of observations. And things like, is there a series of observations that meet criteria for light curve inversion? Pretty much just very simple at the moment, just the number of how many objects, for an individual object, were there more than a certain number of observations with sequential noise greater than 20? Well, or did the series of observations meet requirements for color determination? Maybe there were a certain number of observations within a given time period that have single and multiple filters that have signal to noise greater than 10, for example. And you can summarize those as across the population, what's the fraction of the population that we can do like curve inversion for, or do color determination. And of course, once you have the fraction of the population as a function of H, and you know the absolute number of the objects in your population as a function of H, and you know the H distribution, you could turn those into absolute numbers of objects that you could do these kind of things for. Another metric is just the likelihood of determining activity for a given object. This is actually really very simple. It's just, did we look at it? And it was above 5 sigma. And so there's no criteria that, like, the seeing was better than something, the signal to noise was better than something. So, you know, there's improvements to be made as well in all these metrics.
Does speaking of the seeing thing, does the system enable that to be included in the metrics? Just hasn't been included for it because there's no need for it yet?
Oh, it just hasn't been included in this metric because I didn't know how I would include that. Okay. So it's just this metric is just very simple. Did we see it? And then I'm going to assume that if we looked at the object, but we could have detected activity if it was above 5 sigma.
Okay, but so like if we wanted to include seeing for say.
Yeah, that's available at that point. Yeah, that's available at that point in the metric. Anything that comes out of OpSim can be passed along. It may not currently because of the fact that, because of how I do this with the Sims moving object step in the middle, for each of those observations of the objects, I'm carrying along the information from OpSim at that line. Maybe not the most efficient way to do it, but it's faster than querying it again at the next stage. And you know, sort of doing cross match there. So I do carry along the seeing, the 5 sigma depth for the observation. Obviously, it's like the filter. But if there's more stuff that is in the OpSim output that is useful, we can include that too. And then I was trying to think about some potential metrics to write. Maybe, you know, some ideas for the hack session about metrics. This is just what I imagine. I'm sure there are many more. Does an object become lost or have a large gap in observations? And then you could look at that. What's the fraction across the population? Does an object receive enough observations to measure a rotation period, or, you know, are they suitable for doing that? Will an object need follow-up on any given night? This is kind of an interesting question because there's a lot of questions surrounding follow-up and what follow-up requirements will be for LSST. And it might be a little complicated to determine which objects need follow-up, but you can imagine, okay, so I have all the observations LSST will have for this thing. How can I make a criteria that says, this object will need follow-up at some point? Improve versions of existing metrics and other things that people can. In general, I wanted to point out small boundary metrics. You can write it for something that you have in mind, but it could be applied to any of the other populations. A lot of these are generic. So you can generate different sets of the observations using different sets of orbital elements, and then run metrics, and you can look at it over different populations. You can, like I said, was explaining, you can clone over the age, or you could use a larger input population, and each one carries its own age magnitude. The point is that these metrics serve to define the performance of a given survey strategy in a quantitative way, because that's what we need to be able to balance all the different survey strategies together, right? We may have particular concerns regarding the survey strategy for the solar system. Weak lensing may have different survey strategy concerns. At the end of the day, this is going to come down to, actually, I have a slide. So this is where it comes to the call for white papers on the survey strategy. So those metrics that tell you how to evaluate the survey for a particular science goal work together to tell you what's the best survey strategy for you, right? So this is the current baseline survey strategy. As John said, this is a sort of working goal strategy, but it's been primarily project driven. But I don't think we've made, terrible choices, but it has been project driven, not community driven. And so the call for white papers is our way of now taking this to the community and, okay, how do we make the survey strategy for LSST responsive to the entire community, the astronomical community, and make sure that everybody has input in it. There's much more details on sort of the process in that call for white papers. It's a hefty document. It's about 30 pages, but it has lots of information. The basic idea is the call is now available. We have some simulated survey strategies that are available for sort of jumping off points. We will be working on more as time goes on. We want people to think about what would be best for their science and tell us about it. And tell us how that you measure whether a given survey did well at your science. That's the really important part. And also then tell us, okay, and if you fall below this figure of merit related to my metric, like say we fell below 50% completeness for NEOs, then how does that break your science? What is the thing that's so that we can understand, if the weak lensing people come back and say, actually, we just want to do wide, fast, steep, and we really want to get lots of R-band in the first year in really good conditions and sort of prioritize that, and then work on other filters later. I don't think they will, by the way, but you could imagine that we understand what does that do to solar system science and how do we balance that across the different goals. And will be a survey strategy committee that in the end, the project will create various simulated surveys that sort of try and respond to these white papers. We will use the metrics that people provide to evaluate them. Then we provide a report to the survey strategy committee. The survey strategy committee, which will be composed of people from the community, led by the LSST operations director or the interim director, if we don't have one. Will be the ones who make that decision on how in the end to come up with a survey strategy that balances different science goals in an appropriate way.
When the final strategy is decided, it won't be changed.
So that's a really good question. I mean, I think so. What they will come back with is a suggestion or a recommendation for the initial survey strategy for LSST. Obviously, as the survey progresses and we get actual data on the sky, things will have to be reevaluated. So the concept that we talked about is intended to be sort of a living document that goes forward as well. The call for white papers is sort of now, here, please tell us about this and make any big changes that you want to make. The concept will be a way that a place where metrics live and can be updated, and sort of a way to let people know how to evaluate things for your science. The initial survey strategy, I don't know how long we would commit to staying with the initial survey strategy, and that would change. So I think that the details on that policy are sort of still a little bit fuzzy, and I think it's kind of understandable. We don't really know what's going to happen when we get on the sky. We have a pretty good idea. Somebody could come up with some other really greatest, amazing thing that we need to change the LSST survey strategy to respond to. But there'll be some policy on how fast that will change, and I don't think it would be. I couldn't imagine getting through this process in less than a year in general, but I don't know what it will be.
I don't know if this is a question for you or probably is a question for you. I don't know if it's a question for this talk exactly. If we were to say, okay, we've got some great idea and it involves just pointing at this one place on the ecliptic for a night, just one spot, and doing 12 hours on this one spot. Do you have any sense of how many small bodies would be in a particular spot on the ecliptic? If we said we're going to get 1,000 light curves, we're going to get 100 light curves.
I see. Yes, because they're mostly asteroids, right? And then if you do one field on the ecliptic, you have on the order of 5,000 objects in a field of view. It probably depends a little bit on what the size distribution of the point end is. It's on the order of 5 to 10,000.
In single visit,
Yes, in a single visit.
you were.
But if you were sitting there for a whole night, yeah, you're right, and then maybe you would do some shift and stack as well. But if you were looking for light curves,
Right, I'm trying to think about things that would not involve a huge perturbation to someone else's strategy, but that.
yeah,
Oh,
and
really?
that
It's
would
one night, right?
be great,
Right.
like mini survey.
Can you tell me no pairs at all, question mark? Does
Oh,
not mean
okay.
what it sounds like it means?
I will talk, we'll talk more about that.
Okay.
Lynne doesn't have to go into too much detail, but yes, it's up for grabs.
Fight this battle every 2 years.
I understand.
So what I will say there is that discovering objects for the solar system is one of the 4 primary science drivers for LSST. So we won't do something that will make it impossible to find solar system objects, right? If Mario's no, I'm not supposed to talk about it. Okay, all right. So if secret plans do not pan out, then there will be pairs, and so there will just be pairs. I don't think you need to defend the fact that we need pairs in this call for white papers. Actually, I probably shouldn't have put that down there, except that we do have a simulated survey that doesn't have pairs. I think you can make a metric that says, oh, this is our discovery criteria, you have to, right? And then obviously it's 0 if you never have any. Pairs in the same or different filters, I think, is a good question, though. There's definitely some interest from other science cases to have pairs in different filters. And I think it's not obvious which one would be the best. So, probably in the end, you do something like some pairs are in the same filter and some pairs are not. You just figure out which the fraction is, and then after the first year, you probably adjust it.
That's how the current baseline is, I think. Some are the same and some are different.
Yeah, some are the same and some are different, with no guiding intelligence, right? It's expensive to change the filter, so most of the time they're in the same filter. But you could do something like, say, I really want to change the filter, and we're working on a simulated survey where that happens. And you might say, I want to change the filter half of the time. I will point out one of the things that Jelko told me that is pretty impressive to me. Like, you think, oh, it's just a small improvement in the survey. Like if we improve efficiency of observing by 10%, but the survey lasts 10 years, so a 10% improvement or actually essentially either you get a year of LSST for free, or you could look at it as you're getting what is the cost per year? 100 million?
40 pence. So operations is about 40, but if you amortize the full cost, it's.
So if you make a 10% improvement, it's like $100 million. Pretty good, right?
If you make a 1% improvement, make a 0.1%.
That's actually even more impressive, isn't it? Because those are easier.
Impressive.
Yeah. So it's worthwhile. Okay, so right, I was going to say right metrics is important and have science justification for the related figures of merit. You asked about, do you want code or do you want descriptions? We will settle for descriptions, but we would really like code. And you can put the code into SimsMath Contrib and add sections to the COSAP, including the supporting text about the science cases, You can also, if you have, especially if you have something you're saying, I would like a particular observing strategy, then the white papers is definitely the place for that. Oh, and here was my links for further resources. In particular, I'm sorry, I don't have a short link, but this GitHub repository in the LSST PST organization, survey strategy, has lots of resources related to the call for white paper. So that is my last.
There are a lot of questions as Lynn went. Good question.
So, how many other people have run SIM's moving object besides you?
Besides me, nobody, but I think you're all going to do it later today.
No,
Yeah.
I want to.
Yeah.
But
So one of the things that has historically been difficult with LSST packages, under some circumstances, is installing the stack. So you didn't get to talk about it yet, but I think
I'll mention it when we get into questions.
okay. But we have a shortcut around that, and Mario will talk about it.
By the end of the 3 days, we all will run.
Everyone who wants.